Hello, thanks for joining us for this VEMU and Estonian Music Week lecture on the impact of popular music on Estonian and Soviet youth culture and politics. My name is Marcus Kolga. Over the next hour or so, we're going to take a dive into the colorful and sometimes strange world of Soviet pop and politics. From Shostakovich, the Soviet Union's original punk, to Propeller, and from Boris Grebenshchikov's Aquarium to Charles Lloyd, music played a significant role in Soviet culture and society and acted as a window of freedom and hope in a tightly controlled Orwellian world. We'll talk about Estonia's rock music legacy, but also that of the Soviet Union and Russia, because in many ways, they're interconnected and complementary. Music and rock and roll provide a common language, and it is a place where creativity intersects with shared basic human values, freedom of expression, and identity. In today's Russian political environment, bands like Pussy Riot and legendary Soviet-era musicians Yuri Shevchuk, Boris Grebenshchikov, and Andrei Makarevich continue to struggle against the oppressive regime in that country. On the surface, we may not have much in common, but through music, there emerges a common desire for freedom, independence, and creative autonomy. There's a reason why Soviet music journalist and expert Artemy Troitsky chose Tallinn as his home while exiled from Russia. Bear with me for a moment as I give you some pretty basic philosophical and psychological context to all of this. It's an important part of understanding why many young musicians risk getting ostracized by the Soviet authorities, losing their jobs, and even going to prison. It's long been held that music has the ability to influence behavior by affecting the emotional and mental state of the listener, performer, or composer. Confucius wrote that music has the ability to stimulate behavior. Plato, Socrates, and other Greek philosophers also contemplated the very real effect of music on the human mind and soul, and therefore choice and behavior. German philosopher and musicologist Theodor Adorno introduced the idea that within music one can find expressions of ethical value. Adorno believed that mass media, including music, has the power to manipulate populations both negatively and positively. A song or performance by a musical group can deeply affect any social group and strengthen their members' sense of belonging. Musicologist Marcello Keller wrote that through music making, we so easily exhibit, manifest, or even advertise our sense of belonging and clarify to ourselves who we are, or think we are, or would like to be. Music is partisan, he wrote. It is always for someone and against someone else. Governments recognize this power. In the United States, authorities were extremely concerned about the subversive nature of music throughout much of the 20th century. Folk musicians like Pete Seeger used music to promote political change, which put him in direct confrontation with U.S. authorities. Meanwhile, rock and roll pioneer Bill Haley was considered to be promoting delinquency, and Elvis Presley's swinging hips betrayed a sinister and perverted intent.
These men come down here from New York and from Florida to find out my reasons on rock and roll music and why I preach against it, and I believe with all of my heart that it is a contributing factor to our juvenile delinquency of today. I 100% believe it. Why I believe that is because I know how it feels when you sing it. I know what it does to you. And I know the evil feeling that you feel when you sing it. I know the lost position that you get into in the beat. Well, if you talk to the average teenager of today and you ask them what it is about rock and roll music that they like, and the first thing they'll say is the beat, the beat, the beat.
It's also well documented that John Lennon was targeted for surveillance by Richard Nixon's administration and was eventually served deportation orders. In the immediate post-revolutionary Soviet Union, the Bolsheviks allowed for fairly broad creative freedoms. That came to an end in 1928 when the Bolsheviks imposed strict government controls on all creative expression. In 1932, the Union of Soviet Composers was created for musicians and headed by a Soviet apparatchik. In 1934, Maxim Gorky introduced the artistic doctrine of socialist realism, which was adopted as Soviet policy at the first Congress of Soviet writers under the direction of Andrei Zhdanov, the same Andrei Zhdanov who directed the annexation of Estonia for Stalin in 1940. Dmitri Shostakovich, considered by many to be one of Russia's finest composers, was as horrified as his other countrymen when in 1936, Shostakovich's friends and family were arrested and either imprisoned or killed during the Great Terror. It's widely believed that Shostakovich composed his Fifth Symphony in response to Stalin's purges. The Fifth is regarded as a highly risky and political work that was cleverly disguised behind the facade of socialist realism imagery of workers in factories, modern cities, and the rumble of infrastructure. What is most remarkable is the emotional reaction of the Leningrad audience at the symphony's premiere. The audience was moved to tears, and many openly wept. Shostakovich would later write of the audience, quote, "Of course they understood what was happening around them, and they understood what the Fifth was all about." At a Central Committee meeting in 1947, Andrei Zhdanov condemned all Western culture, but especially its music, and none more so than jazz. A number of prominent Russian jazz musicians were arrested and deported to Siberian gulags in the late 1940s, and because saxophones embodied jazz, the instruments themselves were banned in the Soviet Union starting in the 1930s. For the Soviets, jazz needed to be condemned due to its capitalist roots. A 1952 Soviet publication claimed that jazz was intended to kill the man in men and to create cannon fodder, while a different publication claimed that jazz affected the central nervous system of listeners and prepared them to fight the wars allegedly planned by Wall Street. Its outlawed status made it attractive to Soviet youth, who scrambled to find any source to hear the Western music. In 1953, Stalin died, and things started to change. Not a lot, but the fear and terror that Shostakovich tried to capture in his Fifth started to lift just a little bit. The Voice of America was among the first sources of Western music to penetrate through the Iron Curtain. In 1955, they began broadcasting the Music USA jazz radio program with Willis Conover, who played leading U.S. jazz artists on shortwave to millions of listeners in Eastern Europe and Russia.
Good evening. Willis Conover in Washington, D.C. with Music USA, Part 1. The Voice of America presents The Big Bands.
In Estonia, Finnish radio was transmitted into homes on the northern coast of the country, including Tallinn. Estonians benefited from the close proximity to the West and were more exposed to Western culture than any of their Soviet neighbors. Since Western records were banned in the Soviet bloc, industrious youth devised a clever method of distribution using discarded X-ray films from hospitals, embracing a truly DIY system that would have fit in very nicely in the 1980s punk rock culture. The X-ray films were cut into 7-inch discs, and a hole was burned into the middle with a cigarette. Russian musicologist Artemy Troitsky writes that, quote, grooves were cut at 78 RPM with the help of machines. Troitsky says that the quality was awful, but the price was low, a ruble or a ruble and a half, but the discs couldn't be played more than 10 times before being destroyed. These bootleg records were known as ribs because you could usually see human bones taken by the X-ray and were produced throughout the 1950s and even into the 1980s. Now, for the authorities, the ribs recordings represented an unacceptable threat to their control of Soviet youth and youth culture, and a ban on these bootleg records was implemented in 1958. But by the mid-1960s, it was becoming apparent to the Soviets that they couldn't contain the spread of Western music any longer. In 1965, driven by progressive youth in the Soviet Youth Komsomol, the Soviet leadership grudgingly accepted jazz as a formally recognized genre of music within the official Soviet culture, chalking up an important political victory for Soviet youth. The first real test of this new softening of Soviet culture came in 1967, when Soviet authorities agreed to a request from Estonia to hold the first ever Soviet Jazz Festival in Tallinn. Tallinn 67, as it was known, would bring together jazz ensembles from across the Soviet Union. While the festival represented a shift in the politics of culture in the Soviet Union, the content of the festival was tightly controlled by the authorities. The most remarkable and historic aspect of the festival was that an emerging American jazz artist, Charles Lloyd, was invited to participate, the first such an appearance by a U.S. artist, and at the height of the Cold War. Willis Conover, the host of VOA's Music USA program, was also invited to the festival. It's important to recognize that Charles Lloyd was invited to officially participate, and not necessarily play. By wording the invitation in such a way, the Estonian festival organizers were able to gain the approval of the state organs for Lloyd's participation. They would worry about the playing part once he arrived in Tallinn. When Charles Lloyd arrived in Tallinn, the festival organizers would not allow him to take to the stage. Lloyd responded by telling an Associated Press stringer in Tallinn, Fred Coleman, that the Soviets, quote, wouldn't allow me to play because I'm black. For the Soviet authorities, who were known xenophobes, but publicly claimed to be internationalists who fought for the rights of black Americans, Lloyd's comments were problematic on an international scale. Attempts by Soviet authorities to fix the public relations nightmare border on the comedic. Over several days and several times, local authorities promised Lloyd that he could play, and then reversed their decision when he showed up at the 6,000-seat Kalev Sports Complex in Tallinn. At one point, he was warming up backstage, preparing to go on, when an official pulled him back. In return, Lloyd told the foreign press in Tallinn, once again, that the Soviets were refusing to let him play based on the color of his skin. The Soviet leadership in Moscow were furious and ordered local authorities in Tallinn to let Charles Lloyd play for just 8 minutes. He asked Fred Coleman, "What do they think I am, an animal?" He acquiesced after Coleman convinced him that it was the jazz fans that he would be playing for and not the Soviet authorities. And instead of the 8 minutes that were allotted for him, he played for nearly an hour. The landmark first international concert in Tallinn was recorded and later released in the West. Charles Lloyd in the Soviet Union. Charles received a 20-minute standing ovation. Yet in an official Soviet documentary about the festival, Charles Lloyd receives less than 5 seconds of time, a clear indication of the threat he and the culture he represented to the Soviets and the authorities. If jazz caused a hurricane of panic among Soviet authorities, then rock and roll was a tornado. In Estonia, youth were being exposed to rock and roll via Finnish radio and television, as well as the Voice of America, British Radio Carolina, and Radio Luxembourg on medium and shortwave radio.
Morning, this is Radio Carolina North, resuming its transmissions for another day.
Estonia, given its proximity to Finland and its distance from Moscow, became a well-recognized breeding ground for the development of rock music. Estonian audiences caught their first glimpse of the Beatles in 1964 when Finnish television broadcast their first concerts. Youth all around the capital of Tallinn huddled around the TV sets of friends whose apartments were closest to the sea in order to witness Beatlemania. In the early 1960s, bands were formed first in the Soviet Union by young men in Estonia. Since Western records were nearly impossible to obtain, they created bands to reproduce the rock and roll they heard on Finnish radio. Juniorit, or juniors, are considered to be the first Estonian rock and roll band, perhaps in the whole of the Soviet Union. Followed closely behind the Juniorit were the Optimisti, the six-piece band whose sound was closer to the Rolling Stones. Without any proper musical equipment, bands like Juniorit and Optimisti were often forced to improvise if they wanted to play at all. Legendary Estonian musician Harri Kõrvits, who played in a number of bands, including Optimisti as a 12-year-old drummer, told me that Estonian musicians needed to be extremely resourceful to find instruments to play with. Acoustic guitars were made into homemade electric guitars using parts found in some pretty unique places. Kõrvits told me that there were public telephones on the streets of Tallinn, and inside of them were, of course, pickups or mics. The end that you speak into was cut off and inserted into the guitar. According to Kõrvits, this became a problem for the authorities because kids were going around Tallinn stealing the ends of these public telephones. Kõrvits, a drummer, got his first basic drum kit in 1965. The skins of the drum heads, he says, were made of real leather. And when he played in the main hall in the Blackheads Hall in Tallinn, he remembers putting the drumhead skin on a radiator. The heat, he says, made it quite taut and made a sound like ping, ping, ping when he hit it. Halfway through the first song, it went bong, bong, bong. There were just so many people packed into the hall that they were playing in, which made it extremely humid and made the drumhead less taut. The Unity bass guitarist, Johan Halliste, was initially without a proper bass guitar, and none were to be found in Tallinn. To solve this problem, Halliste took along a tape measure to a concert by East German singer Barbel Wachholz, and after the concert, he asked the bass player to see his guitar. Halliste took out his tape measure and a pencil to measure the dimensions of the bass, the body, the neck, and the head. He then found some appropriate wood and cut himself his first bass guitar. He would repeat this at least once more before he was able to purchase a proper instrument. These early Estonian rock bands generally played in small clubs around Tallinn, including those that were sponsored by various Soviet factories. Each of them had its own Soviet workers' club. Harri Kõrvits recalls over 1,000 people coming to hear Optimisti play on the weekends, with shows on Saturday and Sunday nights. Political messaging was not included in any of these songs played by the bands, despite the fact that their existence was having a political effect in providing their audience an independent and non-Soviet identity. Mikronid, featuring future Estonian rocker Gunnar Graps, and Kristallid, whose guitarist Jaak Jaula would become one of the greatest Soviet pop singers, were considered equally talented among a number of other bands. Just as their reaction to jazz was delayed by several years, Soviet authorities only began recognizing the power of rock and roll as a cultural, social, and even political movement in the late 1960s, when they created an official designation for approved performers called VIA, also known as Vocal and Instrumental Ensembles. The typical state-approved VIA band consisted of anywhere between 5 to 8 players. They dressed the part of rock and rollers, but played radio-friendly, non-threatening songs that were composed by members of the State Composers Union. Their approved songs were recorded on the state record label Melodia. Lyrically, the bands generally sang about love, but also patriotism and their devotion to the Soviet Union. One of the best-known Russian VIA bands was called Veselye Ryabята, Happy Guys, who even had their own Soviet TV show. Their appearance remained Soviet conservative, but they did eventually record heavily accented versions of Beatles songs like Obladi Oblada. Each VIA also had a state-appointed manager who controlled the creative output of the band. 65% of the VIA band's repertoire was to be Soviet in origin, 20% Soviet bloc, and 15% was allowed to be Western. Thus, the Soviet state had complete control over the official pop music scene. It's interesting to note that former Estonian white supremacist Minister of Interior Mart Helme, who was recently forced to resign because of his ongoing racist and homophobic statements, was also once in a state-approved rock band named Fix. Here, he is crooning with them in 2018 in Tartu, dedicating his performance in honor of Brexit.
You stood and you watched us. My baby left town. You could have done something, but you didn't do. You didn't do nothing. You let her walk by.
In Estonia, the grassroots rock movement of the 1960s gave way to state-controlled pop music in the 1970s. Many former Estonian rock and roll singers joined the very Soviet-style Estrat variety scene. The Virmalised singer Jaak Jaula became one of the most famous and was nicknamed the Kremlin's Nightingale, partly due to his popularity with Communist Party bosses, and the fact, as well, that the majority of his repertoire was sung in Russian.
Я пою в нашем городке каждый день в шумной тесноте.
Tõnis Mägi, who as a young lad occasionally took to the stage with Optimistid, also became a well-known Soviet Estrat singer, although he eventually returned to rock and roll. Perhaps it was a reaction to the dead end of pretentious art rock and the safety of the VIA and Estrada acts that energized a new movement in Soviet rock music. As in the 1960s, Estonian musicians pushed the envelope of political creativity and embraced the dangerous and aggressive new sounds that were being beamed in from Helsinki in the UK in the early 1980s. Future leading punk rockers like Singervinger's Hardy Volmer were soaking up anarchy in the UK and White Riot, embracing the new sonic liberty that this new genre punk rock offered as they prepared to shock the wholly unsuspecting Soviet public with it. Politically, 1979 saw the implementation of a harsh new Russification policy in Estonia that sought to enforce the learning of Russian among Estonians. There was concern among Soviet authorities that Estonians were refusing to learn Russian. Shelves in the stores were empty due to Brezhnev-era stagnation. The Tbilisi Music Festival kicked off the year's musical calendar with incredibly provocative performances by several Soviet acts, including Russia's Aquarium. The product of Aquarium's frontman and primary songwriter Boris Grebenshkov The band played psychedelic rock that was steeped heavily in the traditional singer-songwriter style. Furthermore, Grebenshkov considered himself to be a punk. His drive for personal and creative liberty conflicted deeply with the Soviet concept of a homogeneous and collective society. People like Grebenshkov, Volmer, and later Yuri Shevchuk would not give in to this assimilation.
They can't control you.
Yes, exactly. And they were baffled, and we took it for granted because we were living this way. We were living outside of a straight society. Like
But your listeners know that, though.
Yes.
They know that you're outside of the system.
Yes.
You're not on Melodia. You're not in the Writers Guild.
Yes.
They know this.
Yes. And that's why they feel that we are expressing something that is valuable. Because nobody would risk all this shit without expressing something that is extremely valuable. We had treasure that nobody else had.
But you didn't know. Were you conscious of this?
Oh, absolutely. Because we ruled the universe. We could do anything, like any fucking thing in the world. But because we was existing outside of a straight society, it's all right.
How much harassment did you receive?
Nothing, not really. 2 years I had a black car standing downstairs.
2 years.
Yeah, like 6, 9, 80, 85, 86. And when KGB trying to follow the American students, they would like frequent the unofficial flat I was living in.
The Tbilisi Rock Festival in 1980 was a turning point. Akvarium's performance there was perhaps the most shocking and edgy in the history of the Soviet Union. During the performance, Grebenshkov stroked the neck of his guitar suggestively and even worked himself into a frenzy, falling to the stage when the cellist in the band mounted him while the band continued playing uninterrupted around them. Immediately after the performance, Akvarium was banned from playing by Soviet authorities, who cited the band's degenerate homoerotic behavior for their decision. Meanwhile, in the Estonian university town of Tartu, a few students had decided to pull together their own music festival for the second year. Tartu Rock had been a fairly modest event in its first year, but the 1980 edition would prove to be a launch pad for an entirely new musical direction and movement. Russian music critic Artem Troitsky has called the Tartu Rock Festivals the most progressive in the Soviet Union with the highest degree of talent and innovation anywhere. In 1980, influential artists like Inspe, founded by renowned composer Erkki Sventur, Sven Grünberg, and Propeller had their festival debuts in Tartu. Propeller's punk rock ethos came through immediately, with the grotesquely unique frontman Peter Volkonsky reciting poetry between songs. A University of Tartu newspaper article about the band had them listed as, quote, Ein Punks, Prit Punkberg, Ivo Punks, Riho Psip-Punk, and Peter Punkovsky. Propeller went on to win the Best Live Act of the festival. Their influence among Estonian youth skyrocketed. Their name was spray-painted onto bus station walls in Tallinn beside Western punk acts, the Sex Pistols, and the Ramones. Historian Imbi Bayu told me that, quote, the lyrics in Estonian punk and rock songs at the time weren't directly political. You had to know how to read between the lines, and we'd all learned how to do that. There was always a message if you knew how to look for it. With the momentum of Tartu behind them, Propeller's next large public performance would become legendary in Estonian history and would cause a panic among Soviet leaders in Estonia and Moscow. It would also be their last.
Siin koos teiega meie ansambel Propeller, kes on teie teejuhiks.
In late September 1980, a football match between the staff of Estonian State Radio and Estonian State Television was organized to take place in a sports stadium east of the center of Tallinn. The match was advertised both on radio and television, with the addition of a halftime performance by a rock and roll band named Propeller. Most importantly, the match and show were advertised as being free of charge. Masses of youth arrived at the stadium only to find out that tickets were required for the event. According to those who were there, many of the youth ignored the requirement of any ticket and simply pushed through into the stadium. According to those who were there that day, the stands were full well beyond capacity. According to historian and politician Lauri Vahtre, from the band's first chords, the music, lyrics, and presence of Propeller inspired a revolutionary reaction in the crowds. With the audience energized by the band, the second half of the football match began, after which Propeller was scheduled to play a second set. At the conclusion of the match, the two sides exchanged gifts, in this case, carrots and cabbages, and proceeded to lob them to the audience. However, the youth weren't interested in these vegetables. They threw them back at the team on the pitch. According to Vachta, the Soviet authorities at the match decided that sending the band back out to play would only inspire further aggressive behavior in the youth at the stadium and called off the band's second set. Yet, without warning, the 5,000 youth in the stands burst onto the stadium's pitch. The majority of the crowd was dispersed by the milic, the police, who drove their cars onto the grass pitch, but another estimated 200 to 500 started marching towards the old town of Tallinn, chanting, "Put Brezhnev on pension," and "Down with Gretskina," who was the ethnically Russian Minister of Culture in Estonia. At the gate of the old town, some 100 youth were arrested, and another 70 headed up to the government area on Tombia Hill in the old town. When they headed back down, they were detained and beaten by Soviet authorities, according to Vachta. Nor did Propeller's lead singer, Peter Volkonski, escape the authorities either. He was taken into custody and interrogated by the KGB, who later released him after clearing him of any direct wrongdoing. However, his band Propeller would never play together again as Propeller. The riot sparked a series of other riots, where youth chanted anti-Soviet slogans. Former Estonian President Toomas Hendrik Ilves recalls that the riots that followed the soccer stadium incident represented an explosion of anti-Soviet sentiment. The riot hit almost every Estonian city, including Tallinn and Tartu. The Kadriorg riot episode clearly demonstrates how music can directly provoke and inspire an emotional and political reaction. The political situation in Estonia had become incredibly difficult with the new Russification initiatives and the widespread economic stagnation that had caused empty store shelves. There's little doubt that Estonian youth were seeking positive change, and music became an outlet for both their hopes and their frustrations. At the same time as Propeller was being chased by the Soviet police in Tallinn, a young Russian musician, Yuri Shevchuk, was also being lured by the power of rock and roll. In 1983, he traveled from his rural central Russian home in Ufa to Moscow to compete with his band DDT as a finalist in a songwriting competition. There he met with members of Rock September, the other finalists from the northern Russian city of Cherepovets. Using their winnings, the bands came together under the DDT name to collaborate on a new record. The collaboration would have a major impact on both Russian and Estonian music, as the lead member of Rock September was the well-connected son of the director of the Cherepovets Symphony Orchestra and later Ultima Thule guitarist Slavka Kobrin. The foursome recorded an unsanctioned record in Cherepovets, originally entitled Monologue in Saigon, but later renamed Kompromiss. The album included politically provocative lyrics, including Nie strelje, don't shoot, that would eventually land the entire group in trouble with the KGB. After the sessions, Shevchuk left Kobrin in Cherepovets and went back to Ufa. According to Kobrin, the musicians had very little money after the recording, and Shevchuk was forced to borrow money just to get back home. Given that the record was entirely unsanctioned, there was clearly no mechanism for the record to be released. The record became DDT's first full album and was initially released just to friends on homemade tapes. Yet within weeks, the recording went, what we would call today, viral. DDT's Kompromiss became the most successful underground recording in Russian and Soviet history. Recordings of the politically charged tape made it to the far corners of the Soviet Union, as well as the desks of the KGB in Moscow's Lubyanka. In Cherepovets, the KGB approached Kobrin's father, who was informed of his son's involvement in this Samizdat DDT record. An ultimatum was given, and Kobrin decided to pack his bags and move into internal exile in Tallinn. Shevchuk had found new players to replace Kobrin and the others in Ufa. The authorities banned DDT from recording or playing publicly throughout the 1980s. Shevchuk has since become one of the most vocal critics of Vladimir Putin and is considered to be the country's voice for rights and social justice. Many have said that Shevchuk is to Russia what U2's Bono is to the West. Kobrin, who was arguably one of the best blues and rock guitarists in the Soviet Union, arrived in Tallinn in the mid-1980s and established his own band, the Kobrin Blues Band, which performed at the 1986 Tartu Music Festival. At that festival, Kobrin connected with Riho Sibul of Propeller, who was in the process of forming a new band, Ultima Thule, with legendary former Estrat singer Doniz Megi. The band would go on to become the first Estonian band to break through in the West, with a Canadian tour in 1988 and major festival appearances throughout the Soviet Union. Ultima Thule is arguably one of the most popular bands in Estonian history, along with Singer Vinger. On a personal note, I had the honor of knowing Slavka Kobrin as a friend and musical mentor when he moved to Canada in the mid-1990s. Slavka called me a few months before he died in 2016 and told me the story of DDT and the political fallout that forced him into exile in Estonia. I'm forever thankful to Slavka for exposing me to Russian rock and roll music.
Lülitu on taevas verisinine, täiel linnal hingab nüüd iga inime. Silt ja vasar enam kedagi ei löö, tähendavad meile nüüd nad rõõmsad tööd. Tere perestroika, demokraatia, diktatuuri küüsis on pääsemas üks maa. Tere perestroika, tere õnne tipp, enam nii jube ei tundu punalipp.
Johnny Rotten, or John Lydon as he's known, leader of the Sex Pistols and later Public Image Limited, landed in Tallinn in the summer of 1988. The air was charged with anti-Soviet sentiment that had been sparked by a growing independence movement thanks to Gorbachev's glasnost and perestroika. Lydon's PIL was in Tallinn to play at the landmark Rock Summer Festival and was immediately swept up in the energy of the moment, as well as the dangerous atmosphere. The over 100,000 people who had gathered for the festival posed a serious potential threat to the Soviet authorities. The prospect of independence from the Soviet Union had gripped Estonians, and a mass gathering like the one at Rock Summer in '88 could inspire a final push.
Et juba nii palju oli uksi irvakil, et kõik oli näha ja seda tegelikult see glasnost ju tähendaski. Eks ole, avalikustame, eks ole, ja siis ei olnud võimalik tegelikult ka enam eriti nii-öelda piltlikult öeldes potile kaant peale suruda enam.
The movement had begun and there was no stopping it.
The poverty was astounding, and then the suppression. And the way we were escorted into the old town. And the people were cleared out of the square. We weren't allowed to talk to anyone. And this was madness, I thought. This is a system, a political system, that really can't maintain a stranglehold like that for too long, and indeed it didn't. You can't be ushering people away from outside influences in that way. The human spirit is too enduring and good-natured in its immediate, instinctive act of rebellion to institutionalized thinking.
That same summer, at the Tartu Music Festival, overtly nationalist songs by songwriter Alo Mattiisen were performed by the festival artist. Ei ole yksi maa brought a message of unity and courage in the face of the independence movement. And Eestlane olen ja eestlaseks jään, Estonian I am and Estonian I remain, sung by Rock Hotel singer Ivo Linna and backed by Mattiesen's band Inspe, became an anthem for the independence movement. On August 20th, 1991, the Soviet Union effectively ceased to exist, and rock and roll provided the soundtrack to the disintegration of the empire. There is little doubt about the well-documented power that the music has on human emotion, behavior, and how we interact socially and politically. In the context of the Soviet Union, it provided youth a much-needed alternative social and cultural identity to that which was offered by the Soviet authorities. By offering an identity outside of the Soviet-controlled one, rock music provided both social cohesion for like-minded groups and national unity later on. Soviet authorities were aware of the power that music could have on their citizens and clearly worked towards censoring and controlling music, which began already in the denunciation of Dmitry Shostakovich and the creation of the Soviet Composers Union. Ultimately, music, and specifically rock and roll and punk rock, inspired those who participated in the movement for Estonia's independence and across the Soviet Union. My friend Imbi Paju, an Estonian historian, told me that, quote, both Western and Estonian rock music provided a symbolic and psychological freedom for us during the occupation, she said. Just by losing ourselves in the music and dancing, we were connecting with Western non-Soviet culture, and by doing so, we were telling the system to go to hell.
think that the Soviet Union was a country where conformity was enforced. So anyone who didn't conform was always going to be in trouble. And that doesn't seem to have changed at all in the new Russia, whether you're a woman in a punk band, whether you're gay, lesbian or transgender, whether you are someone who believes in free speech and democracy, you'll still be stepping over the line all the time.
Revolutions do not always turn out the way that you expected them to turn out.
Oh, great.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Andres Kasekamp. I'm the chair of Estonian Studies at the University of Toronto. I hope everyone enjoyed the film. Alustasime. Okay. All right. Okay. So let me start again here. We're figuring this out technically. So let me thank Margus for an excellent presentation. I want to say that he should be lecturing at the university with this sort of high quality presentation, which looking at all the with all the work that he's been doing, I was wondering whether he would be actually doing a film on this. Now, for all of you who are watching this, you should be writing your questions in the YouTube chat. And we'll see what's written on YouTube chat, and I will forward the questions to Marcos for answering.
Well, super. Yeah, I'm looking forward to seeing those questions. But before we start chatting and answering some of those questions, and I'm hoping that you can hear me. I want to thank Piret and Elis and Johanna, Rasmus and Davi at Vemu for pulling together the technical aspects of this this lecture / presentation, inviting me to talk about this topic that I so love, rock and roll, and especially Soviet era rock and roll. And thanks to you, Professor Kosekamp, my former scout leader, for introducing me to Echo and the Bunnymen in 1984, because I think that sort of launched and opened my sort of views on music and my certainly expanded it. So thank you very much for that.
Okay, so let's see if there are any questions. I don't actually see any yet. Estonians, of course, are known to be very reticent, and it's always a challenge with an audience of Estonians at who will ask the very first question. I see a lot of comments praising the presentation and saying that Jaan Kittas, that it's an incredible production and really enjoying this. And I think that speaks for everyone who's here. But perhaps, Marcus, you can tell us about the interviews that you did.
Sure. I mean, you initially mentioned that it looked like I could have been working on a film, and indeed I was working and have been working on pulling together a film about Soviet era rock and roll, punk rock, and such. And for that, starting I guess around 2014, 2013, we started conducting a number of interviews. I had a production team in Tallinn that was working with me as well, and some of those interviews you saw John Lydon at the end, Johnny Rotten. We ended up interviewing him at the last PIL concert in Tallinn, and I think it was 2013 or 2014. Maybe you were there, Andres. I'd be surprised if you weren't there. In fact,
I actually wasn't, but it was,
oh my goodness,
2013.
It was 2013.
Yeah.
So I think that was the first interview that we did for the film. And then we did Billy Bragg as well. I think that was in 2016. Jan Sillenberg and I flew to Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, somewhere near Allentown, sort of, I think it was about a 2-hour drive west of Newark, New Jersey or something like that. And Billy was great. I mean, we did the interview. It was pretty early in the morning. We spoke for about an hour, and he was surprised. He said, no one's ever asked me about my Soviet era. So back in 1980, or I think it was 81 or 82 or something like that. Or no, maybe it was later, 86. Billy Bragg actually went to Tallinn. He was one of the first rock musicians, and he went to on a tour of the Soviet Union, went to Tallinn, to St. Petersburg and Moscow. And there's actually a documentary film about this. And you can see that he was at the beginning of this film that he was very excited to go, to be in Tallinn, because he's known to be a bit of a socialist, perhaps back then even a communist. And you can see his mood and his understanding of the situation sort of evolve during that entire documentary film. And I think after that documentary, his views on socialism, certainly communism and Soviet communism, changed. And so, we wanted to talk to him about that time and what he saw and what he felt. And he gave an incredible interview. And what's interesting is, we were sort of stuck in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania for the day, and we were there for his sound check. And then he saw that Jan and I had our cameras there, and he said, listen, do you mind shooting a couple of videos for me? And so we actually, while we were there, we did some work for Billy. He was a generous, wonderful guy. And so that was our second interview. And then in between, I've been able to interview Yuri Shevchuk when he was in Toronto about 3 years ago. It was mostly in Russian, but again, an incredible guy. And Boris Grubenchkov, who you saw in the presentation, I guess, who I spoke for, I think it was 2 years ago, and he was great too. 45 minutes. We talked about his entire experience, the development of Aquarium, and the importance of rock music, not so much as a direct political movement, but certainly as part of the importance of it to Soviet identity and Soviet youth identity, and having some sort of independence. And so those were the interviews that I still have those interviews, and I'm still thinking about making this documentary. I think it needs to be made, especially on the Estonian side too. I think the story about Slavka Kobrin with DDT with Shevchuk is a fascinating one. That strange intersection, because Slavka was in Tallinn for a number of years and was an important part of Ultima Thule as well. Anyway, so I'm hoping to make this documentary, but we'll see if somebody has some ideas about funding. Send them along to my YouTube or my Facebook account or my email.
All right, now finally the questions are piling up, but before I get to some of them, when you're talking about Billy Bragg there, and you mentioned earlier that you were sort of got into all this stuff when you saw Echo and the Bunnymen, then
in your car, I heard Echo and the Bunnymen in your car.
But the first time I saw Echo and the Bunnymen was the first time that Billy Bragg actually performed in Toronto, and no one knew who Billy Bragg was. He was the opening act for Echo and the Bunnymen. People sort of introduced him. He's this British guy. He's like Bob Dylan, but a British version, is what people said. But everyone was there for Echo and not him. But he blew everybody away, obviously, Billy Bragg, as the opening act. But now I have a bunch of questions. Perhaps first related to the film, Johanna was actually asking, so do these musicians, do you think, do they really understand the impact that they have on society, that they're a force for change? Or are they very conscious of it?
That's a good question. I asked BG Boris Grubenchkov about this, and I think he did understand the overall impact. I mean, he and those Russians I mentioned, there's Andrei Makarevich, and of course Yuri Shevchuk. I think they understand the impact that they had, especially Shevchuk back in the day, because his lyrics were politically charged. And the fact that, as I mentioned in the lecture, Shevchuk didn't have a record company. He didn't have Melodia. He didn't have the state behind him. So he was forced to look for other ways to distribute his work. And the viral way that first DDT record went out into the public, I mean, it's legendary. I mean, if you talk to any Soviet era rock musicians, everybody knows about that first DDT record. So I think they have an understanding. And having spoken with Hardy Volmer also has an incredible understanding, I think, of the impact that music had. I mean, he has that nice quote at the end. I mean, the entire interview that we had, I forgot to mention that I also had the interview with Volmer. He understood that the power of the music, that again, if it wasn't explicitly political, it was political in its nature, because it was a way for Soviet youth it was taboo to express individuality. And so as that music changed, I mean, we saw that early 60s, beat rock and roll, it transformed into Via Strat, which was this, pretty shellacky pop music. And then that punk scene happened, and that's where that individuality exploded. And I wouldn't say that it contributed to the collapse of the Soviet Union, but, I think it was part of it. And people like Hardy, I think, and Shevchuk, the ones that, these people that I've spoken to about it. And, I spoke to Kobrin Slavka Kobrin, but just before he died, he also understood the impact of it. So I think they do. I mean, again, I haven't talked to Yuri, Prihosibul about anything like this. Propeller may have a different perspective on it. I doubt it. I mean, I think they understand the impact of that Gotyork show, but yeah, I think in general they do understand what their music meant to society.
All right, now I have a question from Andres Kesteris from Ottawa, asking you to relate this to the singing revolution, the famous singing revolution of 1988, which of course is also the title of a documentary film, and now a musical coming up as well.
Yeah. Sure. The singing revolution was obviously important. I mean, again, it's about identity, and it's our cultural and national identity. And I think that if we're talking about the singing revolution, it's had that same sort of, it had that same, that's the political nature was the same. And I think that rock and roll and punk movement sort of enabled that later on with these song festivals, because rock and roll was very much part of those song festivals. It wasn't just a bunch of people singing choir songs. I mean, these were new songs, the Inspe songs, the Matizen songs, in Estonia at least. And I think that I think it enabled that entire movement. Now, the singing revolution in the Estonian, I mean, I think most former republics of the Soviet Union claim to have their own sort of singing revolution. I know the Latvians, say they also had a singing revolution. So I don't think the Estonians are the only ones who are singing and revolting.
But the Estonian one was first.
But okay, there we go. That's very important, especially for Estonians.
Well, it was important for everyone. Estonia was the example that others followed.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. For some other questions now. I got Steph Perry, who's the host of Extreme Distort on CIUT, the university radio station, on Sunday evenings.
Right.
And we did a show on Punk Behind the Iron Curtain with him recently.
Yep. Great show.
So he's got a question about some of your sources. First of all, is in doing his radio show, he came across a few books on Estonian rock music and punk, and is asking what have you consulted, and have you seen these? And he has a second question, which comes out also very clearly, is particularly for the punk and previous rock scene, is the influence of Finnish music and musicians from Finland.
Sure.
Which you get also a little bit of in a very good documentary film that Gyur Arma did years ago, Disco and the Atom Bomb.
Fantastic film. Yeah. Well, first of all, that Gyur Arma's film, and I think it was Jaak Kilmi who was the director of it. That truly was a fantastic film, and that is important. I mean, I think I mentioned in the lecture that Estonia's proximity to Finland was extremely important, because the radio waves and the television signals from Finland were able to reach Tallinn, and I think that Finnish radio undoubtedly from the 60s onward had a significant impact on Estonian youth culture. And also, I mean, there was pirate radio, there was Radio Carolina, VOA also had an impact, but Finnish radio, and not just Finnish radio, but television. I mean, like as I mentioned in the lecture, the fact that the Beatles' first performances were broadcast, Estonians got to see them. If you were living in Moscow, you probably weren't seeing these things. And so Estonia was really important. As for sources, and I just want to mention that
Finland,
yes, I just wanted to quickly mention that Mr. Perry, I spent my first night in 1990 in Estonia with him at a fire near Pyhajärvi. So hello to him. As far as sources go, I mean, there are a number of them. I wrote a fairly long essay on this. It's about 40 or 50 pages about 3 years ago. So I don't remember all of my sources for that paper. I could go through the bibliography or I could send it to him. One of the most important sources, though, is this book. And I don't think you can see the video. Maybe you can't. No. Can you see the video? Johanna, can you switch on that video? No? No, okay. So it's a book called Back in the USSR by Artemy Troitsky. Another person who I've managed to interview is, in fact, Artemy Troitsky was he pulled all of these amazing festivals together during Soviet times. He was the one organizing them, and he knows everything about Soviet era rock music and punk rock. And he, as I mentioned in the lecture, he actually lives in Tallinn right now. He's in self-exile because he's being critical of the Putin regime. But I would say that book, if anyone is looking for an entertaining read and to learn about this history, the Troitsky book, Back in the USSR, is the book to read.
All right, here's a couple of questions that I'll group together, which are sort of about more your personal journey. First is from Reet Martin Seer, who sort of asks about your own sort of personal journey into discovering Soviet Estonian music. And the second question is from Lillian Boost, who recalls that you had performed yourself with your own group, which you haven't mentioned here yet, in Estonia, and is asking about that experience. But before you answer that, let me say that something that we all have in common is that Metsa Ülikool, the Estonian Forest University in Muskoka, was a place which introduced young Estonians back in the 1980s, when there was still the Soviet Union, to music from behind the Iron Curtain. And I remember very clearly Ingvar Liitoja was the guy who had tapes from Singer, Vinger, and Propeller, and I heard this all for the first time and it opened my eyes and ears back in 1987 in the first time I was in Metsa Ülikool.
Well, but what was it like for you then? The first time you heard that?
Blew me away. I had no idea, because of course, all of us who grew up in Canada as young Estonians had really no inkling of what was going on in the music scene behind, well, besides for Entel Tentel, which was going on behind the Iron Curtain.
So I guess the first time I was exposed to Estonian rock music would have been around the same time. I think a relative had sent me a cassette. I remember it was yellow and blue, and it had the Jotem Kae song with Tere Perestroika on it. And that blew me away because it sounded like the stuff that I was listening to. So, the Clash and the Sex Pistols at the time. And it sounded like that, and they were singing in Estonian, and they were singing stuff, the lyrics, connected with me. You're singing about Perestroika in the opening, and whether it would have any impact on I guess Estonian youth at the time. And it was incredible hearing that for the first time. And after that, it was, I guess, in 89 when Ultima Thule, Riho Sibul's band, who was in Propeller before Ultima Thule, and Slavka Gobrin was also in Ultima Thule, they came to Canada and they did a tour with a Canadian band called 5440. And I remember them playing they were playing at the Estonian House here in Toronto. And they played at the Estonian House in the Transact Club.
It was the Transact Club. I remember that gig. It
And that was mind-blowing to see just to see Estonian rock and roll, and it sounded sort of like our more or less like our rock and roll. And
then they opened up for 5440 at Massey
Yeah.
Hall.
Oh, is that Massey Hall? Right. Okay. So
Yeah.
that was part of the tour. It's just incredible. And I was lucky enough because I was in Estonian school at the time. And they Ultima Thule came to the school and I started talking to them. And eventually, we ended up going, we had a party with them and a couple of times, and I actually got to know them quite well. And in the summer of, I guess, 1992, I went to Estonia, and that's when I started playing music, and I spent about 3 weeks there with Kalle Vilpu. So Slavka Gobrin had by that point left Ultima Thule and come to Canada, and Kalle Vilpu, who was their new guitarist, was in the band at that point, and Kalle and I spent like 3 weeks together in the studio, just mucking about and writing songs with Raul Vaigla, who was also the bassist in Ultima Thule. And I mean, it was just an incredible summer because I was hanging out with these Estonian rock and roll musicians. They accepted me as this young cultural person who's interested in culture and music and such, I guess. And that really, completely transformed me. And actually, I think it cemented my Estonian identity in me, that trip. But to Lilian's point, yes, we were invited to play at my band Megapop at the time. We were invited to play at Rock Summer in Tallinn in 1998 in the summer, which was also a mind-blowing experience because we were, I think, second to the headliner on the bill. We got some money from the Canadian government, which we actually used to record a record, which we finally put out like 3 years ago. But we recorded in Linnahall, which anyone who's seen the movie Tenet will know. There's a studio in the basement there that used to be this dingy sort of, I guess, had something to do with the technical aspects of Linnahall, but there was a studio that was built in there. It was sort of legendary in Tallinn, but it was pretty gross. But we were there for the entire month of, I think it was July '98, and we'd flown in a really well-known producer then in the UK named Jessica Corcoran, who'd produced Ned's Atomic Dustbin, which was one of our favorite bands, and Shed 7, and the Wonder Stuff, whose shirt I'm wearing if anyone can see it. And we spent a month there. It was incredible. And the show at Yle Summer was incredible. There was a lot of, along with these other Estonian musicians, there was a lot of fun to be had at that gig. Don't quite remember all of it, but it was an incredible moment. And so Estonia obviously is very important to me from that part of my life, being a musician. There's a strong connection there for me, so maybe that's why I'm interested in this history as well.
Let me just mention that there's more connections between Toronto Estonian musicians and Estonia. It was Peter Kopvillem and his band who were the first to tour Estonia during the Perestroika days, and that was sort of a mind-blowing experience for all who were present. And then later in the 90s, Arne Tork from Toronto, who's now in Vancouver, was a regular member of Boiler,
right?
Playing along with one of the best bands in Estonia at the time.
Yeah.
So now I have a couple of questions which are about sort of contemporary bands in Estonia. One of them is from Peter Einola, who's saying that bands like Propeller and Singer Vinger still resonate today. Is it a question of nostalgia or is it something deeper? And the sort of follow-up question of that is, so what contemporary bands should we be paying attention to? And Steph Perry also asks along those same lines that, so are there any Estonian punk bands now who you're following?
Well, I mean, why does Propeller continue to resonate? I think their role. I mean, we saw, in the presentation, I sort of talked a bit about their legacy, and I think that Kadriorg show and who Volkonski was, what he represented, I think that was really important to the identity of Estonian youth at the time. Now, I could be mistaken. I haven't really spoken to anyone about this, but I'm speculating that that's probably what it is. It had such a significant impact. As far as musicians today are concerned, what I find interesting is that the composers union continues to this day in Estonia, and it's a really weird system that I can't get my head around. We have a musicians union here in Canada. We also have a royalty society, and you can go into that if you pay to get into the union. You can get into the union, and they help you out with your getting paid at shows and that sort of thing. Whereas in Estonia, you have to be really you're graded and you're asked to enter this society. So not everyone can go in there. That's the people who are in that society are very extremely talented people. But there's a lot of creativity that remains on the sort of margins, that these are musicians that aren't necessarily part of that formal, recognized establishment. And I've actually found that a lot of bands outside of it are among the most interesting ones right now. There's a wonderful record label in Estonia called Sex Sound. It's not X, it's SEKSSOUND. Their office is in the basement of the ERR television building. The owners are longstanding sort of employees of ERR, which is the national broadcaster. And they put out some amazing stuff. They're terrible at marketing themselves. If they were better at marketing themselves, they would be much bigger worldwide. But they have had world tours. I think Pia Fraus was in Toronto for one of the Estonian Music Weeks, I think 2 years ago, wasn't it? We were at that show together, right?
Yeah.
Fantastic sort of shoegazery music that really, I think they've been played on BBC Six. There's another new up and coming band whose name totally escapes me right now, and I'm going to look it up. It's a band. Their song is called Country. Man, where is it? I was going to look it up beforehand. Anyway, here it is. Holy Motors is the name of the band, and Country Church is the name of the song. It is great. That Steve Lamacq from BBC Six, who used to be, I think, BBC One for years in the 1990s, he was the guy that led the sort of the Britpop thing on the DJ side on BBC. He's now on BBC Six, and he was playing these guys throughout the summer. And I think they've sold quite a few songs on iTunes and such. But this is a great Holy Motors. Check them out; they're fantastic.
All right, you reminded me the studio in Linnahall, which has sort of been scheduled for demolition, the whole building, and which does get blown up in Tenet. I hope that's not a spoiler for anyone who hasn't seen the film yet. I was lucky to see it in the summer in Tallinn and to recognize all these familiar places. But one of my favorite Estonian bands, Kosmikud, who've been around for many years, just released their new album this week, and it was recorded in that same studio where you were in Linnahall. So that's still a functional part of Linnahall if the rest of it is still only derelict.
Yeah.
Steve Perry asks about, do you know Winnie Pooh?
Yeah, I do. I've seen their videos. I haven't downloaded any of their music, but yes, I'm sort of aware of them. They are interesting, but also there are a few others. Metsatöl, which is just from a personal viewpoint, it's hard for me to listen to extremely fast guitar playing and screaming, but I think some people find it interesting. And then there's there's a rapper, Cash.
Tommy Cash.
Tommy Cash, that's right. And Tommy Cash is probably, I would say at this moment right now, probably the most famous Estonian musician in the world.
Besides Rod Robert.
Yeah. Besides, well, of course, yes. I'm sorry, pop musician. I should have qualified that. You're absolutely right. Arvo Pärt is by far the most famous Estonian musician possible, probably ever. But Tommy Cash is quite popular as well.
Part of Tommy Cash's appeal, of course, just like Winnie Pooh, is the visuals, the performance, rather than the actual music.
Yeah, they're absolutely crazy videos that they produce. Absolutely, yep.
And Steve also asks about the punk song festivals that I've been. There's been 3 of them in Estonia. I was lucky to attend one of them in Rakvere, but I mean, I could talk about them, but it's your show at the moment. So he asked you,
I think it's both of us
about the Anarchy in the UK sing along.
Yeah, no, I mean I've seen them all. I haven't attended myself. Yeah, they're quite interesting. The fact that they're doing these sing-alongs. Were you there when they were? I mean, I remember seeing the video. I think it was Thomas Henrik Ilves who was in the front row singing along to Anarchy in the UK.
Yeah, that was the very first one. I saw the subsequent one at Rakvere, but that was sort of a very alternative take on something which is sort of very at the core of Estonian culture, the song festivals, and then to do a punk song festival.
Yeah.
Well, maybe I need to explain it a bit because maybe not all of the listeners and viewers are aware of what this concept means. So you have the choral singing, the big festivals every 5 years, and then they do a smaller alternative song festival where the repertoire is entirely punk, both international, like Anarchy in the UK and God Save the Queen, but then Estonian punk like Propeller and Vennaskond. But it's also choral singing. So you have hundreds, if not thousands of people on the stage singing in unison punk songs along with the audience who's following this. So this is a family-friendly event for, I mean, obviously most of the people there aren't punks themselves, but they enjoy choral singing.
Yes. Yeah, it's very Estonian, very Nordic, in fact.
Well, we got one comment here from Eric Babak that this is all too reminiscent of the radio program, The Ongoing History of New Music. So commentary on our show here at the moment. Jan Kittas was asking earlier about you put so much effort into this presentation, and as I commented, it looked like maybe you're preparing for a documentary film. And Jan asks, so if you would be doing a documentary film, what additional aspects, which you didn't mention in the presentation, would you like to focus on as well?
Well, that's a really good question. I mean, I would look into other aspects of youth culture, because I think that's what's really interesting. And that's that triggered the initial idea for the film, is looking not just at music. I mean, telling the story through music, but also looking at other aspects of youth culture. We know what we were doing here in the 80s. We know what we were approximately doing in the 60s and 70s, with Beatles and Beach Boys and that, all of that. But growing up, I was always fascinated because I had a cousin who was the same age as I was. I mean, I think we were born 2 hours apart or something like that. And I often thought, because I was told that this cousin was living there, I'd never met him, I would often think, growing up, what is he doing right now? What's he seeing? What's he doing? Because we were always taught that life behind the Iron Curtain was absolutely miserable. But, I think for a young person growing up, I think the perspective is a little bit different. Even if you're over there, perhaps you don't have these freedoms. You're still having, I think there are great things that happen to you growing up. It's just different. And I wanted to explore what that means. So here we have that freedom as youth to express ourselves. And we do that. We rebel at youth, and et cetera, et cetera. So if, Estonian youth can't be that much different. So I wanted to know what that looked like in Estonia. What did youth rebellion? How did youth express their independence in that period, especially in adolescence? And that to me was curious. And that's where, music obviously plays a huge part of it. It's the soundtrack to that. And so I think I'd look at that more. And I'd also, I'm fascinated by Russian music. I think that, there are things that we have in common that we can talk about in common, because I think over the past 10 to 15 years, it's very easy. And I write about this all the time. I'm extremely critical. I'm probably one of the leading critics of the Putin regime in Canada, and that's what I do. But that, and I'm called a Russophobe all the time, but I'm not. I'm a Russophile. I love these Russian musicians. I love Russian culture. These people who are struggling for their freedom and for democracy. I work really closely with them. And I think through music, again, I sat with Grebenchkov for 45 minutes, and we got along really well because I think we connected on those levels. And I think that if people saw, and I think Russian speakers here, saw and could be proud of that culture and what these people have achieved and what they're doing, I think that could be really transformative. So anyway, there's a long answer, but that's sort of what I'd be thinking about if I were to ever get some funds to continue making this movie.
Karl Altau in Washington writes, kudos to Allan Teder, who was passing around cassettes in the 80s. Later, one of the best compilations I heard from about 15 to 20 years ago was the Bolts Bite Back. I can't recall which of the Estonian bands were on that, but are you familiar with that?
No, Allan, my life intersected with Allan when Ultima Thule was here, because he was very much part of that sort of scene. And as a kid, I sort of ran into him there, and I've talked to him since then. I think we worked with the Estox Film Festival afterwards, but he's like such an Estonian cultural guru and knows everything about music. And thanks Carl's in Washington D.C. He's an old friend. It's great that he was on, and he also knows a lot about Estonian rock music. He lived in Finland throughout the, I think, mid to late 80s, and so experienced a lot of that in Eesti as well.
And mentioning Finland again, this cues one of Steph Perry's earlier questions about it. We already referenced it already, but he asked, tell us more about the documentary film Disco and the Atom Bomb.
I just sort of watched that again. The film is essentially about how Finnish television affected Estonia. So it opens up. It's really great. It has people adjusting their antennas on the rooftops in Tallinn, trying to point them in just the right direction so that they could capture the signal coming from Finland. And this family gets together. There's a small boy and a young girl who are sitting down to watch Dallas. And the opening scene is the famous Who Shot JR scene, where JR is standing in his office and somebody comes and shoots him. And it sort of talks about how that became, Dallas, J.R. Ewing became like so significant, like these touchstones for, Estonian youth, Estonians in general, to Western culture, and what that Western television meant. It's interesting because I've known Gjord for years and years, since we were in Tallinn playing with Megapop. We hung around with him that entire summer, and far too late most nights. But the film's original name was Mustvalgaken, so black and white window, referring to the fact that most TV sets in Tallinn at the time were black and white, and it was a window to the west, that little box. And then they changed it to a much hipper and sort of catchy name, Disco and Nuclear War. But it's a really, really great film that examines all of that. And if you can, I think it's on Amazon Prime, if I'm not mistaken. I've got my own copy here, but I know it's available on streaming services somewhere.
Carl mentions, of course, that it was this Finnish label, Stupido twins, who put out these first records, who put out JMKE and the other Estonian punk bands. So it wasn't just the musical influence, but it was also Finland was the gateway for this first Estonian bands in the late 80s to get a sort of commercial top quality production.
Yeah, no, for sure. There was that too. There was that financial support, and the infrastructure in Finland came in and supported it. Not just with that, but I think with television and film as well. That entire Rock in '88, it was 88 and 89. I think they were Finnish productions. Yeah. So the Finns were coming in and bringing musicians into. I can't imagine what they were thinking. The profits couldn't have been that big at the time. And this is interesting. I wish I'd asked someone, how much did that ticket to Rocksummit in '88 cost someone? But no, the Finns were really great about exposing Estonians to that culture, and did a lot of work to support it, for sure.
There's so many hit songs of sort of all genres of pop and rock from the 80s and 90s, which are actually Estonian covers of Finnish bands. And there's actually some funny covers which are of, say, Western or sort of American or British music, which has sort of been covered by Finnish bands, and then the Estonians are covering the Finnish version, so it's getting it second hand. But Peter Einola's got a question which is touches upon something we haven't talked about. Another style which is huge in Estonia and influential is folk music.
Right.
He mentions how hugely popular the Viljandi Folk Music Festival is, and how also sort of folk music in the sort of 1980s during the late Soviet period was also a vehicle for expressing sort of national identity and a sort of a form of resistance as well. And Peter in his question also asks that it seems that folk music has got a big sort of revival in Estonia. If you could think of Trad Attack, for instance, which is probably the biggest Estonian band at the moment, and also the one that's perhaps internationally hottest at the moment, or making its breakthrough. And that's sort of ethno folk with this, mixed with all these sort of futuristic elements. So Peter's asking about any sort of thoughts about the sort of importance or direction of the folk music scene in Estonia.
I think you go back to music being part of our identity. If we're looking at, whether it's the singing revolution, all of this, and rock music as well. It's part of our identity, and it's all around us. And I think that with folk music, it truly is. I mean, it's in our DNA, from the instruments to the music, and the fact that it is being revived. I mean, this is. I think Estonians have always struggled to figure out what our culture is. What is Estonian? How do we define our culture? And it's tough. We've had all of these, as a historian, I mean, you among experts in the world, this best, that our culture is largely a mishmash of various regional cultures, which creates an original, unique identity. And I think our folk music, it's something that we hold on to very dearly. And the fact that there are younger musicians who are figuring out ways. I mean, some of this, I have I'm actually looking at it right now, a collection that Piret gave me of three discs of Estonian folk music that were recorded 100, 150 years ago, or 120 years ago. And it's interesting listening to them. I mean, it's not like you put on your favorite pop record and sit back and pour yourself a glass of wine and listen to this stuff. I mean, it's a challenge to listen to this, because some of it is it's atonal. It's not melodic at all. The time signatures are wacky, and the recordings are poor. But it's who we are. And listening to these, it's haunting, because you when I listen to these records, it feels like I'm listening to the echoes of my ancestors and my cultural identity. And so that young people are taking this and taking those traditions and making them, listenable and catchy, and applying, these beautiful melodies to them is, I think it's excellent. It's excellent for our culture and certainly for our identity.
Okay, I've got 3 more questions here. And I think we're going to have to probably wrap this up fairly soon, even though we could probably talk the whole evening.
Yeah.
First of all, it's actually not much of a question. It's actually a correction to what we've been saying, let's say supplementing what we've saying. That when I mentioned that Ingvar Lito introduced Soviet Estonian rock to us at Metsa Ülikool, that was because that was the first Metsa Ülikool I had been at in '87. But in fact, Lilian Boost noted that Allan Teder, who we were talking about earlier, was the original guy who started in Metsa Ülikool introducing Soviet music, and that this had a huge impact on people who were there before us.
Yeah.
Now, Piret has a question about, are you familiar with the Kevad concert in Tartu in the late 70s and early 80s, where Estonian singer-songwriters performed, who had lots of texts from sort of poets like Hando Runnel, who were performing lots of texts which were prohibited. So one thing is the music, but of course the lyrics, and often, I mean, the music is very intellectual in the sense that they're using poetry as the lyrics from poets who are, they're not underground, but from poets whose writings haven't necessarily been published.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I haven't heard of those concerts or performances.
Maybe that was more of a suggestion for your future documentary film to include that.
Well, but it sounds like it. I mean, it's intriguing, and this is what my friend, or our friend, Imbi Bayo, she's told me that as well. I mean, lyrically, you didn't have to be overtly political, but everybody could read between the lines, and that's how those lyrics were constructed to be not obviously political, but so that you could, there was a subtlety and a subtext to them that was political, but protected, I guess, the authors and such.
I think this is not about poetry, but it's about reading between the lines or what the message is. I think one of the clearest examples was Propeller's song Die Woche, which is it was sung in German. Die Woche is simply the week, right? And the lyrics were nonsense. It was a children's poem about these are the days of the week. So it just went about Montag, Dienstag, and there was nothing to it. But it was deeply, deeply subversive to the authorities because it was absurd and they couldn't grasp what it was. And plus it was sung in German, which was kind of a fascist language.
Right.
As such. So Steph Perry's got even more questions for you about the contemporary scene. Here he's asking about, like, the Tartu and Tallinn seem to be sort of two separate scenes. Is that true, that his impression that and I mean, this could be going back to the Soviet period or right up to the present, and sort of a follow-up on that question, are there other cities in Estonia where you could say that there is their own music scene?
Currently, I'm not aware that there is a Tartu and Tallinn scene for music. There, I mean, there could be, and I'm just not aware. The music scene that I'm currently interested in happens to be in Tallinn, but I'm not sure that they, define themselves by where they live. Back in the 80s, it's entirely possible. I maybe Steve knows better than I do about the punk rock scene in the 80s, and whether there was a Tallinn versus Tartu scene. Certainly in the Soviet Union, there were scenes. So you had an Estonian scene that was fairly general, but there was also a St. Petersburg and a Moscow scene. So there was the Leningrad Music Club, which was sprung up in around the 70s, and it sort of helped foster rock musicians, and similarly in Moscow. And there were separate youth cultures. Back then there was a hippie youth culture, and then there was the Stilagi youth culture, which continues to this day. It's this weird sort of fashion culture where, and this started in the late 60s in Moscow, where these men dress up like dandies and sort of like out of some absurd 1960s film, and they continue to do that to this day, but it's completely apolitical. It's sort of weird, like it's like Western culture and fashion is their religion and nothing else exists. But I digress. So yes, there were separate scenes in the Soviet Union, but I'm not aware of a different Tallinn and Tartu music scenes.
Yeah, well, I would say that 2 points to that. That first of all, Estonia is such a small country that if you do a national tour, you basically cover the whole country on a weekend if you play 2 gigs a day. So the idea of being separate scenes, perhaps at the present, doesn't make sense. But I would think of, say, back in the 1990s, a band like Ja Äär was very much a Tartu band that had a Tartu feel. That it was more sort of bohemian, slower paced, whereas Tallinn perhaps had more sort of edgy, and later would be perhaps having more of the hip hop bands, or like Põhja Tallinn. But perhaps now you were saying, of course, there's a Russian language scene in Estonian as well, and that's perhaps becoming more integrated into an Estonian scene than it was, let's say, a decade or two ago. And there's kind of an attempt to sort of build up something in Narva. Right? A lot of Estonian activists, I mean, Echo and the Bunnymen, who we referred to earlier,
Yeah, that's
played
right.
in Narva a couple of years ago.
Yeah.
And that was all the response to, is Narva next? You know, after the Russians invaded the Ukraine, and there was talk about, are the Baltic states next? Then some visionaries in Estonia who were connected to President Kaljulaid came up with the idea that, well, we need to promote Narva as a future cultural capital and get sort of international acts and get something happening in Narva, using a lot of the derelict Krenholm factory as the like a distillery district here.
Yeah. And they Echo and the Bunny when we're going to save Estonia then.
It deterrence.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay, it seems to me that the questions are drying up, though there's plenty of people with effusive praise for this interesting lecture.
One last thing can I add one last thing before we sign off? So I think it's important also to sort of look, we've been looking towards Estonia and the Soviet Union, but we should also look inside, and I'm thinking about Estonian musicians here in the West. And, you know, we should be aware that there have been a few that have really broken through, not, you know, the type of musicians necessarily that go we're in the 60s playing at the Estonian House on Saturday nights, you know, the bands and those sorts of things. But, you know, people who've broken through sort of in a broader way in North America. So like I'm wearing this Wonder Stuff shirt right now, and there's actually an Estonian connection to that. Andres Karu, who's a New Jersey Estonian, and you may remember him from Scout Log at Scout camps, Andres. Andres Karu was the drummer for the Wonder Stuff for a number of years, and he was also in a band called Love in Reverse, which was a fairly important indie act in the early sort of 95 era, and were hugely popular. And his brother Christian Karu also played with them. There's of course Heikki Sillaste, who didn't you have an underground publication?
Alkiri. Yeah.
Alkiri, right, there you go. Heikki, of course, had Hake and the Shakes, and then Digital Poodle, Digital Poodle was a hugely significant industrial act, and was really well respected internationally. And then there's Jan Gittosk, who was in I Spies, who was also watching our presentation today. But I Spies were pretty hot band in, I would say, 98, 99-ish. And there are of course people who have been pretty big in the music industry. Markus Damm, who was heading up publicity for Universal Music. There's Thomas Tremot, who's a really well-known Canadian music producer. Erik Laar, who's a really well-known DJ, and May Potts, who was here on the air on CFNY, also an Estonian. So we've actually had some impact on the music scene here as well, and I just felt like that's something that should be recognized.
Okay, let me just add one more thing for the listeners out there that who are looking for something to read or follow up on, particularly thinking of Andres Kesteris' question about the singing revolution. There's actually my good colleague, Latvian-American folklorist Guntis Smidgens at the University of Washington in Seattle, who a few years ago published the book, The Power of Song, which indeed talks about the sort of revolutionary aspects of sort of non-violent resistance through song in Estonia, in Latvia, in Lithuania in the 1980s. He's looking at it more he's looking at pop music, choral music, and he's looking particularly at the lyrics. Carl Altau adds, the Swedish Estonians also had a few serious bands, not just the Canadian Estonians. And Steph Perry, that Toronto was a refuge for many people. The singer for the first Serbian punk band also moved here and became a lecturer.
Oh wow! Yeah. Oh, that's right. Yeah, I think he did a documentary on Soviet music as well, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah.
Okay, but on that note, let's wrap up. I hope this is being. I think this is being recorded, and people can see this later on this same Vemu YouTube channel. But in any case, I think it's been a fun couple of hours with you, Margus, and hopefully this won't be the last of these discussions. And I think hopefully that you've been given some impetus for following up on your documentary project, because at least you'll have many of people here who would be eager to view any film that you might produce on Soviet and Estonian music.
Right. Yeah. Well, like I said, let's see if I find the time. In fact, I've talked to Art Troitsky about this, and Art would be willing to come on board with this too. So maybe something will happen once we get out of this COVID. So, but thank you for moderating this, and again, thanks to Piret and the entire team at VEMU for hosting this.
Okay, so aitäh, spasibo, everyone.
Good night.